Welcome to the Ghost Show online, my fiends, booze, and ghouls. Your hosts, Seika Groves, Rachel Bender, and Ian Russell will discuss all things paranormal. Prepare to be afraid.
Hey, good morning or good afternoon or good evening or good middle of the night, whenever you're watching this. It's Seika from The Ghost Show, and welcome. And it's just Ian and I today because Rachel is not available, but we have a really fun show. This is Ian's topic today. And Ian, what are we going to talk about?
We are going to talk about the Island of the Dolls.
Yay, my favorite creepy dolls.
Everybody loves creepy dolls.
Everybody but Rachel, so she's
except
actually...
Rachel. Yeah.
I'm wondering now, is she missing this show intentionally?
That's okay. We'll make sure that she watches it later.
We will. We'll make sure that she gets the full doll experience on today's show.
Yeah.
But so what made you pick this? I mean, I find this place really fascinating, but I've never been there. I'd love to actually visit.
Yeah, I've never been. It's a location that I've known of for a number of years, and it's it's an interesting paranormal hotspot, as many describe it.
I think the story's really interesting too, like just how this happened and why it's continued and sort of who's behind it, because it's not it's random in a way, but it's also a sort of contrived place, but for a reason, right? So do you want to introduce us to the sort of back history on this? Because it's not an ancient place. It's not like this has been going on for, 100, 200, 500 years. This is pretty modern, this phenomena of the Island of Dolls.
It is, yeah. Okay, so Xochimilco. And Xochimilco is an area that's in the greater Mexico City boroughs.
Right.
And actually, there is, from what I've seen on various YouTube videos, there is actually some really good Mexican food in Xochimilco. They've got all these public food markets, and the locals apparently just flock to these markets. The food is apparently excellent.
And that's the key, right? You go to eat in places that you're visiting where the locals are, because then you know the food is good. And that's sort of the rule of thumb, no matter where you're traveling in the world, if the locals are frequently, being at these places and eating, that's where you should be eating.
Yep. But we are not here today to talk about food. Sorry. We are here to talk about Xochimilco.
Okay.
Now, Xochimilco, other than the food, is famous for its series of waterways and canals that snake through the city and crisscross through the city. And that apparently is left over from an old lake that used to be there.
Well, originally, if I can interrupt for a second, Mexico City was built on this lake. It was a series of man-made islands that were created where people lived, grew crops, and they used the waterways as transport. So this part, eventually, that was all filled in when Spanish conquest came, but it still exists, as you said, in this area in particular.
That's correct. And within these still existing waterways in Xochimilco, about a 1 hour long boat ride from where you would pick up the boat there is an island, and it's known as the Island of the Dolls. And there's a sad story connected to it. There's no proof that the story is actually real. It could be real, it could be legend. Who knows these days? But the story goes is that what is known is that the island was owned by a man named Don Julian, and he lived there his whole life in this little hut on this just tiny little island, really.
Mhm.
And the story goes is that one day he found the body of a little girl that had drowned in the canal, being carried by the tide through the canal past his island, and he felt very overwhelmed and distraught that this is so sad. There's nothing that he could have done to prevent this little girl's drowning. And what happened is he also found a doll floating in the water. So he grabbed the doll, strung it up in the trees on his island in tribute to this little girl, hoping that if this was her doll, that her spirit would be appeased somewhat after this tragic event. And for 50 years, apparently, until Don Julian's death in 2001, I believe was the year he
Yeah, it's
passed
pretty
away.
recent. Like this was fairly recent.
Yeah, so for 50 years, he spent his life collecting dolls and stringing them up in the trees and putting them in his hut and all over the island to make the spirit of this little girl happy.
Right.
And people now go to the island. They have to go by boat. It's the only way to get there. And visitors are now leaving dolls on the island for this little girl. So it's continuing even today. And so, yeah, in a nutshell, that is the history of the Island of the Dolls.
And it's interesting too, right? Because I mean, the story as you tell it, there's also a few other things where he actually dove into the water to try to rescue the little girl, but he wasn't able to because she was already drowned. But there's also a cross that he placed where I guess he brought her body on shore, and I'm not certain that she's buried there, but it could potentially be that she's buried there because nobody seems to know who this little girl was or who her family was. But you're right, he started with the doll that also he found. And it's interesting because as you know, I'm not creeped out by this stuff. I find it fascinating, and I find it fascinating that, the human psyche has the ability to, invent these methods of ritual per se, because it's become a ritual here at the island, and that it's honoring this little girl, whether she's real or not. Perhaps now this space has become an area that's honoring more than just this little girl, right? People do bring the dolls there, if their own children have passed, and they bring them there as a memento mori to the passing of their children, to, different things like that. So I find it interesting that the island literally now has thousands of dolls on it. And for people who don't like dolls or are, weirded out by dolls, this is probably not their dream vacation.
Right, Rachel?
Rachel hates dolls. And I mean, I didn't grow up with, playing with dolls or anything really. I kind of grew up in a farm environment. So, and I had a brother. I didn't really have any girls around me that I played with until I went to grade school. And even then I was the destroyer of dolls. My friend I made friends with in grade two, she had quite a, collection of Barbie dolls that I proceeded to not really understand because I didn't play with dolls. And at the same time, I was kind of highly into wanting to make them fashionable. So I cut off their hair and I used magic markers to give them extra makeup. And so needless to say, her mom called my mom, and I wasn't allowed to play dolls at her house anymore. My mom had to replace several of these Barbies that I destroyed. But, I continued with my doll fashionista abilities in New Orleans for Mardi Gras when we used to work with children's aid, good children's social aid and pleasure club, and we used to do the parades with them, and they had a sort of yearly get together where they would create different kinds of dolls out of dolls that were donated. So I had a Barbie where I gave her a mohawk and drew on her with Sharpie marker and gave her a whole bunch of tattoos, and I called her Lower Decatur Barbie. And so people that know New Orleans will understand that one. But also, I had one of those troll dolls, and I made her into a mermaid. And so, I have an affiliation with dolls. So before we continue, I want to introduce you to my doll that I thought I'd bring today to the show because she's really unique and unusual. And I think that the little girl on the island would probably love my little doll. Now, her name is Trudy, and it's not, I know your partner in crime. Her name is Trudy, but this little doll came out in about the 1930s, late 1930s, and she was named Trudy. So I kept her, and she's very, very cute. So here is Trudy. Trudy's very unique because Trudy is a changing face doll. So she
very
has
cool.
3 different faces depending on her mood or your mood or the child who may have owned her's mood. And so we have happy Trudy. We have definitely not so happy Trudy. And then we have, of course, the best Trudy of all when she's asleep.
I've never seen one of those before.
No, they're very unique. I mean, they are out there, and they started in about 1920, these, what they call sort of, 3-face or moody dolls. And I just really find them unique because this one, she has the little knob on the top of her head, and it sort of looks like a little bit of a decorative part of her hat or her she's wearing little pajamas that, you can turn it and give her whatever face you need. So perhaps if you're angry at your mom and dad, you would just give her this face. Right? But like I said, I like sleeping Trudy because then I know she's not going to be giving me any trouble. But again, this is kind of the thing that we have with this affiliation with these little dolls, right? We have, sort of an emotional connection to them. And I think that, the gentleman who started this island clearly had an emotional connection to the dolls and his hope that this little girl would be, a little more happy being accompanied. Now, that being said, I was looking at some pictures because I haven't had the opportunity to be there. And we talked about this a few times over the years and we just haven't gotten to the show. But
Well, before we continue, let me introduce you to a couple of the dolls that I have here.
Okay.
That I want to have make a guest appearance on the show.
Sure. So Trudy, wait, let me put Trudy around so she can see your little dolls. All right, what have you got?
And again, it's too bad that Rachel is not here because she would really, really like this one.
I made sure I brought a cute one today.
And here is...
Oh, she's adorable.
What's that? Oh? Well, she says that she wants to be friends with Rachel.
Oh, well, I think Rachel would be quite happy about that. Trudy says she wants to be friends with Rachel, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
what is your doll's name?
We've never named her.
Oh,
We just picked her up actually at a Halloween store a
nice.
couple of years ago. She's actually a Halloween attraction. We've never bothered to name her.
I think you should give her the name Mystery.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
She's a
Then
mystery.
and then we've got
Trudy's giving you the side eye now.
yeah. Then we've got my life-size
Oh,
Annabelle doll.
there you go. She's got some wacky eyes, that Annabelle.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So here's our Annabelle.
See, and those dolls do not scare me in the least little bit. That's the funny thing about dolls. I think little Trudy here is probably more creepy than the creepy dolls because those ones are already in your face creepy.
Yeah, yeah.
Trudy's got her own little mysteries about her. You would think this cute little side-eye innocent face here. Mm-hmm. They're usually the ones to watch out for. But I'm sure Rachel's never going to watch this show, knowing that we have these dolls on here. But let's talk a little bit about the island again. I'm really intrigued at the fact that after, what was his name? Mr.
Don Julian.
Don Julian, or Julian, I guess, if you wanted
Yeah,
to anglicize
spelled
it.
Julian, but because
Yes,
it's
but
Spanish,
Julian, yes,
it would be
with the
Julian. Yeah.
JH sound. I think that there's a new keeper on the island, I believe, and he is the one that introduced the idea of tourism and bringing
The
people.
individual who owns the island now is Don Julian's nephew.
Oh, is he? Okay, well, that makes sense. Carrying it on in the family.
Yes.
Right.
Yep, and it's the nephew that actually turned it into a tourist attraction,
Okay. And we'll have to
which,
make
of
sure.
course, has, in addition to just the public, but out of curiosity, it's also attracted ghost hunters and
Mhm.
paranormal teams.
Yes, and there has been a lot of shows. I've caught quite a few shows that were filmed at this island that have had some interesting things happen, and it makes me think, yeah, it would be a fun place to visit.
It would be, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm not afraid of this kind of situation. It doesn't bother me. I actually am quite intrigued by these sort of morose and, kind of macabre concept of dolls that are somewhat disembodied, because a lot of the dolls that seem to be on the island, while there are, full-bodied dolls, there's also a lot of heads.
Yeah, there are excuse me, there are some that are just in pieces.
Right.
There's heads, there's just arms and legs. Again, I guess just whatever was available at the time for Don Julian to tribute to
Right.
this little girl.
For the little girl. And that's sort of the thing too. And I've noticed, like I say now, I haven't really delved into the tourism side of it, but I suspect that there would be a pretty good market to sell dolls to bring to the island, or perhaps provide the tourists that visit the opportunity to perhaps purchase a doll while they're on the island. I don't know if this is a thing. Do you know if this is a thing?
I have not heard anything about it, so I will assume it is not a thing, but that's actually a pretty good idea. As we know, if you're living on a little island in the middle of these waterways in Xochimilco, you obviously don't have a very great income. So, I would assume that, yeah, doing something like that would certainly be a substantial income for the nephew or whoever. Yeah.
Right. And it's interesting too, because I was doing a bit more reading, because originally the gentleman, he was going around, like he would go back to Mexico City and place like that and go in the dumpsters and kind of dumpster dive for old dolls. and he would collect them, hence the bits and pieces and broken dolls and, heads and disembodied pieces of dolls that he would actually bring back. And as I was reading earlier, I believe a lot of these dolls were, of course, damaged, right? So they were ugly, they were burnt, they were somehow mutilated, or,
Yeah, you look at the
disfigured.
photographs that are out there that are available to see, and yeah, many of these dolls are just in terrible condition.
Right, right. And I guess because that's why they're thrown in the garbage, right? Because they've, had some sort of mishap and they're no longer wanted by, the child who was playing with them. One of the things that I wanted to mention that I read about, which I found really interesting, was the original doll that he found, because it said that she was wearing a little straw hat that had sunflowers on it. And that was what he found floating in the canal or the channel. And that's the very first doll. And that doll kind of has a very special place in the, sort of community of, of
Yes,
lost boys.
he put that very first doll into almost like a shrine,
Right.
where
Yeah.
where all the others are just kind of strung up, here and there. The very first one is in sort of like this little shrine area.
Right. And oddly, she's taken on a sort of saint-like ability where she's said to be able to heal people and offer miracles, sort of, this idea of the doll having certain powers that people come and actually leave, offerings for this first doll, and are able to, take from that something, a bit like going to a church, I guess, and making an offering to Mary or any of the other saints. This is what this doll is now looked at as by people in the area, right? Like locals. This is not so much a tourist thing.
Right.
Although I'm sure that some tourists, if they hear the story, may feel compelled as well to perhaps leave a coin or some sort of token for this doll, and perhaps asking for, some sort of miracle and or, prayer to be answered. So it's interesting that this doll has become this important. And I wonder, if and when the nephew is no longer around to take care, will this island continue, or will, someone else step in, or, what would happen to even this little altar doll now? Maybe she'd end up somewhere else in a local church, or in, somebody else's home, perhaps. It's sort of one of those interesting questions that I always look at these things, because I'm like, well, look at all these dolls that are here. There's literally thousands of them. And to some people, they might just be junk. You would just take them all and throw them in the trash again and be done with them. But this island has created this sort of atmosphere that, if you go by the doll that he has sort of set up as an altarpiece, that has to give you the indication that all of the dolls on the island, regardless of how scary or, terrifying they might look to some people, they all sort of have this same feeling to them. So the island would have this sort of healing, or this special energy, perhaps, that is good in nature and not bad in nature because of how these dolls look. I mean, that's just something I would think would come from this. I know people attach their own feelings to things that scare them or trigger them, but I don't know that this island is meant to scare people. I think it's meant to create a atmosphere of perhaps curiosity, of course, but also perhaps a place where you can mourn the death of a loved one, almost like a church.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, the original start of all of this was a tribute. to this little girl. And of course, it has now grown, as you say, through people's individual beliefs, that now there's talk of, some of the dolls are possessed and they're haunted, and
Right.
and there have been claims from people that have been there, and they've said, "Oh, I've seen the heads move, and I've seen the arms move, and I've heard them speaking."
Well, and again, though, it's interesting, right? Because even if that were the case, would it be a negative interaction? Because everything about this island is a positive interaction, right? I mean, this is a tribute to a little girl who drowned. This is love. This is caring.
Yeah.
This is not a terrifying, possessed sort of, bad place. And I just want to read a little segment from a story that on this island, because this is from the nephew. And he says the doll's name, the one that we were talking about, that's been, for the case, I guess, of a better word for it, sort of sanctified in its own rights as a, healing ability. Its name is Augustinita, or Augustina, and it's the most important doll in the collection, and it's one that the nephew has spent most of his time with, and it is his protector, as he says. And then he goes, since it's believed Augustina has gifts, at night she walked around. She even had the gift to cure him and protect him. And this is the reason why there are plates to leave a little offering for her. So it's interesting again that while the island appears to be so spooky and creepy and strange, that the overall feeling is one of healing and love, as opposed to what it literally looks like when you get there.
Yeah.
I find it so, so interesting. It is one of those oxymorons of,
Yeah, well, you look at the photographs and you watch, videos on YouTube or whatever of people that have are on the boat, and they're filming as the boat comes up to the island, and they see it for the first time, and they're like, "Oh my God!" Because it is initially so macabre looking that with all these dolls hanging down from the trees, it's a bizarre sight.
Right, but as we know, Mexico and the original people of Mexico are very much entrenched in sort of a dualistic concept of religion, right? They have Catholicism, but then they have their own beliefs, and they have the worshiping of their dead, the Dia de los Muertos, the visiting of the graves, the whitewashing, the eating with your ancestors, creating all of the sort of skeletal faces with the Katrina dolls with the skeletal faces and the beautiful flowers and dresses and all of these things. So they have a very dualistic approach to life and death. They understand it. They know how it works, and so people who are not sort of walking that sort of dualicity or dual mentality maybe find this more creepy, where for me I do see the reasoning behind it. I understand it. And I see that while, it looks weird and strange to outsiders, that for people who understand it, it really isn't as odd as it appears. And I don't want to disparage anybody or stop anyone from, going to the island or having their own feelings about the island, but I don't feel like there's anything on that island that is going to harm or hurt or distress anyone unless they bring that with them themselves.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is another legend in Mexico that some people say is associated with the island. And I personally disagree with this, but that's just me. There is a legend of a female spirit. Her name is La Llorona.
Okay.
And yes. Are you familiar with?
Yeah, I am. I am.
Yeah,
But please.
and this female spirit named La Llorona, she basically she takes the spirits of children, and there are those out there that say, well, this because of the little girl at the island, that the La Llorona legend is connected to the island,
Right.
which I don't agree with, but
I don't think the legend of her would be connected to the island, but I can see the connection that, this spirit would indeed be perhaps assisting the little girl that drowned, and so there's a tie there. But I don't feel that, the one is 100% connected to the other in any sort of, stretch of the imagination. That I don't know how to describe her. I will just say that deity or that being, she has been around longer than the island has. And
yeah,
so,
it's an old legend. It's an old
yes, and
legend. Yeah.
so she may be tied because of the child's death and wanting to, assist that child's spirit, but I don't think that the two are connected beyond that. I don't feel that that's, but again, I'm not ensconced in that. But as I would feel, she is a much older legend, and so, tying her to the island, yes, but not being because of the island, her spirit or her, divinity or her ability, let's just say, for lack of, I don't know what she's referred to as. Is she a deity? Is she a spirit? Is she sort of both?
I would say both, depending on, you
Yeah,
you hear some of the talk about her, and I would say it's both.
yeah, because she has a deeper story than just a spirit, just being a sort of wandering spirit. There's much more depth to her story, so I feel like she's more of a, one of the many sort of spiritual deities out there that have a very particular role, and that she would be, that as opposed to just something tied to the island because of the story. And it's interesting too, because just reading, I was reading a little bit more while you were talking there. It says Don Julian Santana, he died of a heart attack in April of 2001. And his body is said to have fallen into the water at the exact place where it's believed the little girl drowned. And there's a black cross and a plaque that marks that spot. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah,
He
so
fell in the exact same spot?
that's what it says.
Wow.
So, who are we to say otherwise? We weren't there. We don't know. But it's interesting because perhaps he was just there, thinking about her, and it was the end of his time, and that's where he fell into the water. So
And it
it's
is a tiny island, so
right. I mean, these islands were all quite small in sort of from what I've read archaeologically in my, sort of background, that these were islands, all communities, right? So people lived on these islands. They had their home built on the island. They, in some cases, had, just enough property to raise their family on their island. And then they had adjoining islands that they were growing crops on.
Mhm.
And so this was a, sort of a floating farming community. I'm not certain that these islands float. I think they were built, mounded, so they're not floating. They're actually quite stationary. But it's a very interesting, area, and just the whole concept of it. I think that if you are going to visit Mexico City, you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't actually take the tour to this island, because there's nothing else like it anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
You know, it is a one of a kind. Nobody else has developed anything like this. And again, it didn't start out as a tourism draw. It started out as a memorial to a little girl. And whether we believe the story or we don't believe the story, however it works, that story is now tied to the energy of the island. And,
Right.
you know, the fact that it is now a tourist destination, I think does help, of course, the family who is still continuing to maintain and look after the island in, you know, some way to give them a livelihood, right? Because I can't imagine, you know, none of the dolls are cleaned. But I'm curious too how many dolls are added every year. I couldn't find anything to give me any update outside of the dolls that were initially collected. I do know people do bring dolls. Some people bring dolls, but I'm not certain, you know, what is the total number of dolls now, or doll parts or pieces of dolls on this very small island. And if you're looking at pictures, there's almost every tree,
Every single tree branch. There's
there's a
dozens
doll.
of dolls hanging from every tree branch. Yeah.
They're all, you know, they're propped up against different things. Apparently there's a little shop there now too, so maybe they are, you know, taking advantage of, you know, making a little bit of money from tourism. But apparently dolls are propped up everywhere. So I'd be curious to just, you know, have a head count on the number of dolls that are
Yeah.
now on the island. You know, but it's very interesting, and yeah, I mean, you know, that would be a neat place to go visit. I think, you
It
know, in
would.
terms
It would.
of seeing things in the world, it's not a, you know, it's a man-made construct, but one of very interesting, and would certainly make for some great photos.
It would. Sure would. Yep.
You know, I would love to see that. But is there anything that you want to add to this story before we say goodbye for today? Or
No, I think not that I can think of. I believe we've covered everything pretty good.
yeah, I think so. So let's give Rachel another tribute to our little friends. I'm gonna make Trudy
Rachel, hey Rachel,
sad because
Rachel,
Rachel's
Rachel, ooh, Rachel,
crying.
oh Rachel.
All right, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next week. Have a good one.
Thank you for watching The Ghost Show Online. Join your hosts again next week as they discuss more tales of the supernatural, the paranormal, and all things spectacular. See you soon. See you soon.